Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
It's indeed a great privilege to introduce our speaker this morning, John Rosenthal, who has been a tireless advocate for sensible gun regulation for over 30 years. I imagine most of us are aware of the billboard overlooking the Mass Pike outside Fenway that appeared in 1995, but perhaps fewer know that that was John's idea, nor that at the same time he founded the advocacy group Stop Handgun Violence that has been instrumental in helping Massachusetts craft some of the most effective gun regulations in the country. John said it was learning, quote, that 15 kids under the age of 19 died every day from the only consumer product that's not regulated. That moved him to action. Basically, the same cause, the safety of children, that inspired the millions of young people who made headlines by marching for gun reform on Saturday. Many commentators on the evening news asked the question, what will happen next? Can a march become a movement? In a way, I think the answer depends a lot on our generation and our willingness to get behind the young. They have the energy, and I believe older adults have the stamina to make gun reform happen in America in our lifetime. And what a legacy that would be to leave to the future. For over 40 years, John has led the way and has made saving lives and enhancing the quality of life his passion. As early as 1987, he teamed with the city of Boston to found Friends of Boston's Homeless that has raised $20 million to provide shelters, food, and job training to thousands of our fellow citizens. As recently as 2 years ago, he co-founded Gloucester's Angels, the police-assisted addiction and recovery initiative, to address the scourge of opioid addiction in Gloucester, a practical program to save lives and help addicts get the treatment that they need. And that program has been copied by many cities across the nation. So we're all indebted to John Rosenthal for his leadership and vision in tackling these issues and giving us a focus for our support. Please join me in welcoming him here today. Thank you. Thank you.
So hello, everybody, and thanks for coming out today. The timing is pretty remarkable. So I was actually in D.C. On Saturday in Washington with nieces and nephews and family. We brought about 20 people from where I live in Gloucester, and we were among the 800,000 people that pretty much filled Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House all the way to the Capitol. And you know, we got there. The march was starting at 12, and we got there right around 10 and could only get halfway towards the stage. It was remarkable, and it was also remarkable that this was entirely organized by students and kids. In fact, not one speaker from the stage was over 18 years old. And there was one as young as 8, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s granddaughter. And there was another amazing kid from who was 11. Um, so, having started Stop Handgun Violence back in 1994 as a business person and a gun owner, I'm somewhat encouraged. But I'm also, I was on WGBH radio from the march on Saturday afternoon. You might have seen me on Chronicle Friday night. You might have seen MSNBC, an interview I did on Saturday. I mean, it was, it's such a mixed blessing. On one hand, since I started Stop Handgun Violence in 1994 with the late Michael Kennedy, one of Bobby Kennedy's kids, and we then started enacting effective gun laws here in Massachusetts in 98, 2004, and 2014, without any undue sort of inconvenience on law-abiding gun owners, but just making it harder for kids, criminals, and mentally ill folks to get guns here in Massachusetts. We now, this state, urban state of Massachusetts, has the lowest gun death rate in the nation. We are the safest state in the nation when it comes to gun laws, and we have gun violence, and we have the most effective gun laws. But as I sat or stood there on Pennsylvania Avenue with 800,000 people, I was just reminded how ironic it was that since 1994, when we started Stop Handgun Violence and built that billboard on the Mass Pike, over 800,000 Americans have died from gun violence. So as I looked around, I mean, it was a sea of people. It was as many people as I've ever been with. And I went to the Women's March. And I saw pictures, and I was somewhat active in the late 60s, in the 60s and 70s with the war in Vietnam. More people attended this march in Washington, apparently, than any other demonstration in the history of DC, which is hard to believe. But as I looked around, 800,000 people, that is the number of people that have died from gun violence in the United States since 1994. In fact, if you go back to 1970, more Americans have died from gun violence in the United States than all U.S. servicemen and women killed in all foreign wars combined. Firearms are inherently dangerous products, like automobiles. So what we did here in Massachusetts is we simply treated guns like automobiles. Training, renewable licensing, safety features, or you can't sell guns in the state. And we gave law enforcement discretion so they could, one, license all gun owners, like me, as well as enforce gun laws. And since 1994, we've reduced the rate of gun deaths in this state through our laws by 40%, and we have the lowest gun death rate in the nation. So we are now the model for the nation, and we're an urban state. And I was really gratified to see that Boston Globe wrap there on the door. If you saw it on Friday, it was one of the best pieces of writing on this issue I have ever seen, and I'm proud to say that I'm partly responsible for it. But like when Sandy Hook happened and 26 and 7-year-olds massacred and their teachers, and like when Pulse nightclub happened with 103 people shot in a nightclub, I approached the editor of the Globe and suggested, this is a Sandy Hook moment. This is a Pulse nightclub moment. This Parkland shooting, although it was just 17 dead and another 17 wounded, it was different. It was different because finally we reached a tipping point where kids are starting to say, adults, you have let us down. Adults, you're responsible for making America the gun violence capital of the world. No other country has this problem. And now our kids are afraid to go to school for very good reasons. I mean, one of the teachers who died at Parkland, I don't know if you saw the story, said to his fiancée that she recalled at his funeral, if I die in a school shooting, because he lived in Florida and was likely that, of all the states, that's a state where it's going to happen. If I die in a school shooting, this is what I want you to say. I mean, what kind of world have we created in this country where teachers are anticipating dying in their classrooms and students are having to do, like, in the 50s, you well remember the duck and cover with the nuclear threat. Now, the threat of dying in your classroom has become more or less regular. I mean, there have been, prior to Parkland, 290 school shootings since Sandy Hook 5 years ago. Over 150,000 kids have witnessed firsthand a school shooting in their schools. And have, if they don't, I don't know how they don't, but and most or many have post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of it. So what we set out to do, and what's outlined in that Boston Globe wrap, that's a 4-page wrap. That is very unusual for a newspaper to do. And if you were watching TV on MSNBC on Friday night, you would have seen or heard Rachel Maddow talking about that piece. So I approached the Globe and said, Massachusetts is an urban state with the lowest gun death rate in the nation. All we do is treat guns like cars, and all we do is hold gun owners like me, gun dealers, gun manufacturers, and law enforcement accountable. We've shown that you could reduce injuries and deaths from guns. We have the lowest gun death rate. We've reduced gun deaths by 40%. And still, we are next to Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, which are 3 of the 30 states where you can buy a firearm without an ID or a background check, including AR-15s, including a .50 caliber sniper rifle with a range of 2 miles that was used at Waco to take down aircraft, take down helicopters. And you can buy that weapon without an ID or a background check in 30 states and at thousands of gun shows. So that story is now getting around the country, and as I was in Washington and meeting with reporters from all over the world, they saw that Boston Globe piece, so that's encouraging to me. And what's also encouraging is that I really got a sense that the students are not going to stop. Because they know, and you all should know, there is a mass shooting of 4 or more people in this country every single day. And there has been for 2 years. And you can go on the Washington Post and you can see where they are. And in addition to the school shootings prior to Parkland, there have been about 30 more since Parkland a month or so ago. And look, folks, if 550 people can be shot in minutes from 500 yards away in Las Vegas at a concert, I mean, that's what happened. 500 yards away with a military-style AR-15 assault weapon. 550 shot, 58 dead, 851 injured as a result of getting trampled and you name it. And like Parkland, like Sandy Hook, like Las Vegas, like Pulse nightclub, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. It was with the AR-15 military-style assault weapon. In fact, Parkland and Aurora, Colorado, you might remember the movie theater, 71 people shot there, and Parkland, made in Massachusetts, Smith & Wesson AR-15, right here in Springfield. And the .223 round, it's about that size, The entry wound, so you might remember after Pulse Nightclub there was another 4-page wrap on the Boston Globe, and I encouraged them to show what an AR-15 looks like. So it was a life-size AR-15 on the cover. And I said, let's also show what an entry wound looks like from a 223 round, which is about like this. And on the back cover, let's show what an exit wound looks like from an AR-15. One round is like this. I was on MSNBC after Sandy Hook with General McChrystal, who was describing what the AR-15 is designed to do. It's a weapon of war. It's fashioned after the military M16. It is designed to stop an infantry. The round is designed not to penetrate the body, but to hit mass and tumble and roll. So the entry wound is like this. The exit wound is like this. The parents of children at Sandy Hook that I have met had to identify their children by their clothing. Because getting, a 6-year-old receiving 3 to 11 rounds, which they all did, indistinguishable looking. So the 500 plus wounded at Las Vegas, or the 17 wounded at Parkland, or you name it. They will never, ever, ever be the same in all likelihood, physically or mentally. So here in Massachusetts, we ban that weapon. We made permanent the ban on assault weapons, and we did one better. So the federal ban on military-style assault weapons that was in effect from 1994 to 2004 that President Clinton enacted, it included 19 specific weapons. The Uzi, the AK-47, the Colt AR-15. But what the federal ban didn't do, it didn't ban weapons that had a certain function, it just had weapons by a certain name. So, Colt AR-15s were no longer allowed to be sold for those 10 years U.S.-wide. But Bushmaster, owned by Remington, which is owned by Cerberus Capital Management, and if you haven't heard of that company is a Wall Street private equity firm, Cerberus Capital Management. Cerberus means three-headed dog guarding the gates of hell. It's the name of a company. And it's the name of a company that not only owns the Bushmaster AR-15, but it owns Star Market, Shaw's Market, Osco Drug, and St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Steward Healthcare. Think about that. So for years, we were trying to draw attention to the fact that we should be voting with our wallet and boycotting the same company where you get your bread and butter, that mass shooters get their AR-15s and ammunition, and Bushmaster AR-15s. And truth being stranger than fiction, finally, Cerberus put Remington, the 20% of the gun industry, including Bushmaster, into bankruptcy yesterday. The weapon used at Parkland and Aurora, as I mentioned, the AR-15 made by Smith & Wesson, which is also called American Outdoor Brands. They're on the New York Stock Exchange. Good company to boycott as well. They are struggling under mountains of debt. Sturm Ruger, another huge company, same thing. And this truth is stranger than fiction aspect of this is it's largely because of Trump. So these huge gun manufacturers were counting on Hillary Clinton becoming president and being able to threaten that she was going to take your assault weapons away. So the assault weapon ban expired in 2004. We made it permanent with Governor Romney in 2004 and included copycat weapons. So you can't just call it a Smith & Wesson AR-15 and sell it here. If it has the same function as the Colt AR-15, it's banned here. And thanks to our Attorney General, who you should call and specifically thank, she has enforced this copycat provision. But what happened in this election was nothing sells guns better than fear. Nothing sells guns better than fear and a good mass shooting. So how do you sell more guns in this country? Which is federal gun policy. And this is the truth is stranger than fiction part. So, we've proven that making it harder for kids, criminals, and the mentally ill to get guns here in Massachusetts, you could dramatically reduce gun injuries and deaths without banning anything except for assault weapons and large capacity ammunition magazines, the common denominator in all mass shootings. We also became the first state in the nation to regulate the gun industry. Imagine that. So toy guns and teddy bears are all regulated. Most consumer products are regulated. And that little 6mm piece of orange plastic on the end of a toy gun, or the little red dot on the end of a toy gun, is a federal manufacturing standard that toy gun cannot be sold without it. But the real firearm that will result in 300 people shot today and 100 people killed today and a mass shooting of 4 or more people today is not regulated. Congress not only gave immunity to the gun industry for being sued, so you can't sue the gun industry, they also prohibited the National Consumer Product Safety Commission from regulating real guns, not toy guns. That's fine. So here in Massachusetts, we regulate guns. They have to have safety features, and that's one of the reasons we've been successful in reducing gun injuries, suicides, and accidents. But nationally, Congress has chosen, and it is very much a choice, folks. I mean, we live in a democracy that we are rapidly losing to special interests, largely because we're not as passionate as the special interest, single-focused voter around guns. So with respect to guns, the majority of people that are shot every day, 300 plus 100 dead, it's handgun violence. And all the mass shootings are generally these large AR-15 assault rifles that have a long range and a large capacity ammunition magazine. That means that you don't have to reload until you've released, if it's a 30 round or a 40 round or a 100 round magazine, you can just keep pulling the trigger. Or you can use the bump stock that was used in Las Vegas, which is a aftermarket, it's a stock that goes on the end of a rifle, and the stock attaches to the trigger, so the recoil from every shot just pulls the trigger, so you don't even have to do this. That's why he was able to shoot so many people so quickly in Las Vegas. We became the only state in the nation to ban that weapon after Las Vegas. Still. So the gun policy that we have all either allowed our Congress to do or not held them accountable for is provide unrestricted access to guns without detection by law enforcement. I know that's going to sound crazy, but there is no other way to describe it. So here's how it goes. If you want to buy a firearm in this country, here in Massachusetts, you have to go to your local police chief, you have to file an application, you have to have background checks, you have to have references, and the police chief has discretion in licensing me as a gun owner. If you can't pass a background check, and by the way, we're the only state in the nation with licensing and registration of firearms. Hard to believe, but true. And we're only a handful of states that have consumer protection standards or ban assault weapons and large capacity ammunition magazines. But if you can't pass a background check, Congress has said it is perfectly legal to go to 30 states and buy guns from private dealers without a background check. That is legal. The Craigslist killer knew that you could go to New Hampshire and get a gun easier than Massachusetts. Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, have come to this country to U.S. gun shows and bought guns because you can buy them without an ID or background check and ship them back, and that's when they've gotten caught. So how do you sell more guns? You have no background check. For 50% of all guns sold in this country are sold privately by private dealers in 30 states without a background check. Criminals know if you can't pass a background check here, no problem, go to Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So here we have the lowest gun death rate in the nation, the toughest gun laws, but you can go to Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, buy a gun without an ID or a background check from private gun dealers. And 2/3 of all gun crime that happens in Massachusetts happens with guns purchased out of state. So that's Maine. So it's Maine, New Hampshire, Georgia, Florida are the primary gun source states for Massachusetts. So if you're interested in selling more guns, have no background check. Then you make law enforcement the enemy of gun rights and say that either Democrats or law enforcement are coming to take your guns away, so you need the same weapons that the military or law enforcement have, which is why the AR-15 is so popular. Because it's like an M16, it's like a military-style weapon, and it's sold with this paranoid view that the government, renegade government's going to come take your gun away. By the way, I mean, that same government has B-52 planes and nuclear weapons and tanks. Your AR-15 isn't going to do a whole lot of good. Then you basically deregulate guns so there's no manufacturing or marketing standards. And you have basically an epidemic of gun violence. And more gun violence, more fear, more gun sales. And as I mentioned, there's a spike in gun sales after every high-profile mass shooting. So the NRA loves, and the gun industry loves, these high-profile mass shootings. So what they were thinking was that Hillary Clinton becomes president, Democrats are going to try to ban certain kind of guns. So whether it was Remington, Sturm Ruger, Smith & Wesson, they all took on more debt, and they all increased their inventory of AR-15s because they thought that's the weapon that Hillary Clinton's going to go after. So now they have all this debt, huge inventory. Trump becomes president, loves the NRA. I mean, he admits to taking $30 million from the NRA and talks about all the time about how he will not disappoint them. And that's without a conclusion to the investigation on Russia actually laundering money through the NRA, which is underway. I mean, and the fact that, I debate these NRA people all the time. The fact that they didn't dispute that means it's likely true. So now these gun companies are literally getting crushed by debt and inventory, and people aren't buying their AR-15s because there's no fear of them being taken away. And then, as you saw after Parkland, that became a defining moment when kids are saying to us, "You've blown it, and we're going to have to do something about it, and we're not going to stop." And guess what? They're not intimidated by the NRA, and they're not intimidated by spineless members of Congress. And like, most major change in this country, I'm hopeful because it's student-led. And whether it was, the civil rights movement was white and black students going to lunch counters and not leaving. Whether it was, the war in Vietnam and 1 million of us marching on Washington, or the divestiture from South Africa. Those were student-led movements. And I really got the sense from these kids, these largely, practically all white kids at Parkland, who are not just saying, we're at risk, but they really embraced the inner city kids too at the marches. Because the majority of gun violence that happens in this country is with handguns, and it's local. Just like I mentioned, all the mass shootings are largely suburban and rural, and with these military-style weapons. So and as we have seen here in Boston, you know, pretty much all the gun violence happens in 3 neighborhoods: Mattapan, Dorchester, and Roxbury. And these are communities where it is far easier to get a gun than get a job. And for decades I have been saying, you know, folks, yeah, it's true. Most inner city gun violence is black on black or non-white Americans. You think it's just going to stop there? And it was just a matter of time before it was going everywhere in this country. And it's truly by design. I know, you know, you all are voters and you've been active and you're probably more progressive than most people in this country. But you probably didn't know that literally you have an epidemic of gun violence as a result of design, special interest politics. So Congress has made a choice. They have truly chosen the millions in special interest campaign contributions over public health and safety. And it's resulting in, no surprise, hundreds of people dying. 300 shot every day, but 100 are killed every single day. I mean, that's like the equivalent of a 9/11 attack every month and a half. And what are we doing about it? We didn't do anything about it. I mean, in Massachusetts we did something about it, but the majority of Americans thought it was somebody else's problem. And so we reap what we sow. And so, can it be turned around? I think it can. I mean, as this Globe piece that you saw on Friday said, I mean, basically if every state did what Massachusetts did, so the 27,000, that big number, that number is if every state had the same firearm fatality rate as Massachusetts. So, as I mentioned, we have the lowest gun death rate in the nation, 3.5 per 100,000 population. The national average is over 11 per 100,000 population. That doesn't include the injuries, which are 2 and 3 times more than the deaths. So it says, basically, if every state had what we have, 27,000 lives a year would be saved. That's a good number. And that is even when 2/3 of all gun crime happens with guns purchased out of state where there are no gun laws. So imagine if every state or every New England state did what Massachusetts did. So, you know, that's the hopeful part. And so, given that really most gun violence is with handguns, and in Massachusetts we have a licensing regime just like for automobiles, and it's renewable every 6 years, and it's through your local police chief who knows you and the residents and the community. So even though you might pass a background check where I live in Gloucester, but my police chief knows that there's been, and this is just an example, but you know, just that police have been called to my house 3 times for a domestic, which isn't true in my case, but I'm just saying for, you know, somebody hasn't actually been indicted or isn't a prohibited buyer, but police know their people. And so if you had, you know, like we have in Massachusetts, discretionary licensing through your police department, it would handle a whole lot of domestic violence, a whole lot of suicides. So roughly 2/3 of all gun deaths each year are suicides because handguns are used versus cutting or jumping or pills, which are not nearly as lethal. And if you go back over time, historically, when a gun hasn't been involved in a suicide attempt, that person does not attempt suicide again. You know, it's a cry for help oftentimes, especially, you know, among kids. I mean, who among us wasn't temporarily insane as a teenager? Never mind, you know, our kids and grandkids. So the last thing you want to do is have a firearm in the home. It is much more likely to be used against you or in a suicide attempt than ever stopping an intruder. So licensing and background checks would do a whole lot to stop homicides, stop suicides, stop accidents. And a ban on military-style assault weapons like we have here in Massachusetts would do a whole lot to stop the mass shootings, which are becoming daily. And after every high-profile mass shooting in particular, I'm asked to debate the gun lobby. And you might have seen my answers on Chronicle Friday night, but the three arguments that you will always hear is the Second Amendment does not allow for regulating firearms. The next one is it's a mental illness problem, it is not a gun problem. And the next is gun laws don't work. It's really easy to rebut those arguments. And if you go on to stophandgunviolence.org /toolkit, just go on to stophandgunviolence.org and take a look around. You'll see a toolkit that we just launched last week for advocates, students, or you all, how to talk about gun violence, how to get laws passed, how to reach your elected officials, and share it with your kids and grandkids. Because if we are going to have an impact on gun violence in this country, it's going to be largely due to us supporting the kids who are finally being listened to and are not intimidated. They're not afraid of the threats from the NRA, and they aren't buying the BS from members of Congress. So, with regard to the Second Amendment, Justice Scalia wrote for the majority in a 2008 decision, 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court. It was a narrow decision, and it overturned decades of prior rule of law with regard to the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And prior to 2008, that always meant you had the right to have a militia which was defined as a National Guard. It was not an individual right. The Supreme Court wrote in 2008, and Scalia wrote for the 5-4 majority, said you can't ban guns in the common use of the time of the founders. And he specifically said, I don't mean sawed-off shotguns and assault weapons. They did not exist. They are not protected by the Second Amendment. Then he goes on to say you can put reasonable restrictions on how guns are sold commercially. And he said, like all other constitutional rights, they are not unlimited. So, assault weapons aren't protected, and background checks are considered reasonable. The second argument is only mental illness, not firearms. Well, folks, you and I know that every country has mentally ill people. They just don't arm them with military-style assault weapons without detection. It's that simple. And then the third argument is gun laws don't work. Well, every single state that has tougher gun laws has lower gun death rates than states with lax gun laws. Every single one. You match up the states like Alabama, Alaska, Mississippi, Florida with Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and California. Look at their firearm fatality rates. They're dramatically different. So gun laws do make it harder for prohibited people to get guns, and they do save lives. But there's only so much a gun law can do if you can drive 20 minutes to New Hampshire, Maine, or Vermont and buy anything without an ID or a background check. So, this is totally doable. This is a choice. It's about defending our democracy and holding our members of Congress and legislatures accountable. So what I would suggest you do here in Massachusetts, if you don't mind, and I'd really appreciate it if you did, because it's very timely, go online to stophandgunviolence.org, take a look at the website, arm yourself with the facts, download or send a link to your kids and grandkids with this toolkit for how to advocate for responsible gun policy. And then please call Speaker DeLeo, our House Speaker, and our new Senate President here in Massachusetts, Bilka. It's really easy to do. 617-722-2000, I think, is the Senate, and 1500 is the House. Ask to speak to the Senate President and the House Speaker. You probably won't get through, but you'll get through to somebody in their office and ask them to please enact the Extreme Risk Protective Order bill, House Bill 3610, 3610. It would help us make it more difficult for folks who are mentally ill or going through a bad mental health period from hurting themselves or hurting others. It's the kind of bill, and it's been proposed in 30 states since Parkland, and it's been passed even in Florida, one of the worst states in the nation when it comes to gun violence and gun laws. So it simply says if you're a family member, you can petition a court to have a gun removed from the home from someone you love, whether it's elderly or young, who's a risk to themselves or others. Extreme Risk Protective Order, House Bill 3610. It's been difficult, even in Massachusetts, to get gun laws passed. I know it seems kind of surprising, but literally outside of 128, and when you get beyond 495, it's really, really gun country out there, even in our state. It's an election year for members of the House and Senate, and so it's just easier if you're from Worcester or Springfield or Hudson or even Gloucester. It's just easier not to take a gun vote. And the Speaker is hearing from his membership in a democratically controlled House. And frankly, it wasn't moving anywhere until recently. We had 600 kids lobby for it on the walkout last week. 600 kids. It was unbelievable. They were unafraid, undetermined. I mean, they were totally like, we're going to the State House and we're going to go ask for this bill, and they did it. And then over the weekend, I got a call from the Speaker's office asking me to come in today and meet with his policy advisor. So that means it's in all likelihood going to happen. But it needs a push, so please do that. And then it doesn't hurt to call the White House, call Speaker Ryan, call Mitch McConnell, I mean, and just tell them that you live in a state where you feel safer as a result of our gun laws, and encourage them to enact the same laws. I mean, look, we are still a country of people and laws. And even though you're right to say that they don't really care about you, and they care more about blood money campaign contributions from the special interest NRA, I mean, they do. So we are either going to have to change laws or we're going to have to change them. And we have an opportunity in November, but we have got to make the gun issue a voting issue like the NRA does and their supporters. And if you really want to get a sense of hope, there are roughly 80 million gun owners in this country, and there's only 3 to 4 million members of the NRA. The majority of gun owners do not support what is truly a racist, bigoted, anti-Semitic, cultural organization, not a gun organization. I mean, I've had, threats on a regular basis. I've had my picture posted, among, Bloomberg and 10 other, people with Jewish last names by NRA board members saying these Jews are responsible for gun control, shut them down, telling their armed people to shut us down. Another NRA board member was quoted as saying 4 out of 5 people who die from gun violence in the inner city are no loss to society. We should keep them better armed. This is a hate-mongering organization that is a minority organization with a big voice who is getting away with murder because we are not holding our members of our Congress accountable. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. And it's beyond out of control. So, they are a minority. They are funded by the gun industry, who's been given immunity from lawsuits, so they don't even need lawyers, in order to sell more guns, in order to increase gun violence, increase fear, and increase more gun sales. That's national gun policy. That's why we have an epidemic of gun violence. We've proven that gun laws save lives without banning anything except for military-style weapons and licensing. By the way, the NRA and members of Congress have no problem with licensing hunting. There's no licensing requirement for guns in most states other than Massachusetts and a few others. But every state, and I have hunted before, you need a hunting license to hunt in any state. And Congress, Trump, and the NRA have no problem with that. And when you hunt deer and duck, you're limited to 5 rounds for duck and 3 rounds in your rifle so it's 5 rounds for deer, 3 rounds for duck to protect the duck and deer population. Licensing and limiting number of rounds to protect the duck and deer population. But when you want to hunt people, no limit. And when you're a police officer, you're given a handgun with 13 to 17 rounds. If you want to mass shoot people, have an AR-15 and a 100-round magazine before you have to reload. That's the law of the land. So that's the extent of which we have subrogated our democracy for special interests. It is the epitome of bad public policy leading to bad public health outcomes. We could easily reduce, whether it's to 27,000 or reduce the majority of 38,000 gun deaths last year and 150,000 injuries without any inconvenience to law-abiding gun owners if we did what Massachusetts has done nationwide. But it's going to take a whole lot of commitment and passion, the same passion that the gun industry has for deregulating firearms, increasing access to guns by anyone, including criminals, dangerously mentally ill, and even international terrorist groups that come here to buy guns, unregulated. So the hope is we can, on the backs of the children now, because we haven't done it, we can support them, we can help fund them, and we can develop a movement to change gun policy like we had developed movements to change the war in Vietnam and change civil rights and change any number of rights in this country. So you're lucky to live in Massachusetts. You are more safe here, but you're not safe because we live close to states with no gun laws. And the more we get involved, the more likely we are to prevent the next Parkland or Sandy Hook or you name it. So I've probably talked way more than I should, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
I just said I have a daughter who lives in France. My only 2 grandsons are over there, and her husband is French. She doesn't want to come back to the United States. She's been over there for 15 years. She doesn't want to return because this is all she hears. The other thing is, first, and I also want to say how articulate the kids were this weekend. They blew me away. I went back and forth from D.C. to Boston, and I went. They just totally, how can I say, they were so much more articulate than our president is. It just incredible. And when they met with him, I felt the same way when they had that sort of round thing in the White House. Those kids are passionate, they're smart, and you're right, they're going to make a difference and they're not going to give up. And lastly, I heard something on the news this weekend that just really floored me. I listen to NPR a lot. And I heard that police in some states, or maybe in certain towns, I don't know, across the country, actually sell, when their guns get old, they sell them back to the public. They have a whatever sale or something out on the street, like the library. I don't know how they do it. They sell their guns to the public. This is the police. And so they can find out later, they can track back later, there might be a killing, and they might track back and find out that gun was owned by the police department and it killed somebody down the street. Just floored me. I don't know how true all this is, but it's astonishing.
It's true. A lot of criminals think it's really great to have a police gun. So they'll pay extra. So what happens in Boston police back in the 90s, we stopped this with Boston Police Commissioner Paul Evans. He will only sell, Boston police will only sell their firearms to the military or other police. But in all likelihood, they're typically destroyed. The old guns are destroyed. But yeah, lots of police departments do that. In fact, the New Hampshire Chiefs of Police Association, after Sandy Hook, when a Bushmaster AR-15 was used to kill those 20 babies and 6 teachers, they raffled an AR-15 off because everyone wanted one because it was used at Sandy Hook. So, only the first sale is regulated from a gun manufacturer or distributor. So Smith & Wesson makes their AR-15s. They make our AR-15 assault pistols. That 223 round is now being made for pistols as well as long guns. And they sell it to a distributor, and then the distributor sells the firearm to a gun store, and only that first sale is ever recorded. All secondary sales, whether it's private gun sales out of car trunks and backpacks, perfectly legal in in 30 states. Firearms sold at gun shows, of which there's like roughly 5,000 a year. They're 2-day on weekends. Most of those gun shows are where private gun dealers sell firearms without IDs or background checks. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, was a private gun seller. So he would go to a gun show where there's a federally licensed dealer who has to run a background check, and he'd set up his table right next door where he wasn't running a background check, and he'd sell the same guns for more money because he could, because there's no background check requirement for private dealers, which account for 50% of all gun sales, at least in this country. So there's no way to detect, without a background check, whether somebody's prohibited, domestic abuser, felon, or international terrorist. So yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of police, when they get new guns, are selling them on the secondary market where there's no background check requirement and criminals want
them. Two questions. You give the NRA a lot of credit, but the membership is is over 1 million. It seems that the tail is wagging a dog. And the other thing, they say that in Illinois, they have very strict gun laws, but still, gun laws are for citizens to obey. The criminals don't obey the laws, is the argument.
That is the argument. Yeah, that's probably that. When I lift the first 3, the fourth is Chicago has such tough gun laws. Why do they have such an epidemic of gun violence? Chicago does have tough gun laws, but Illinois has incredibly lax laws. So you were right about Chicago, but wrong about Illinois. So if you have a little island like Chicago, surrounded by the rest of the state and Indiana and all the other states around it with no gun laws. You don't think the criminals and gun traffickers don't know that? In fact, it was ridiculous in the case of Chicago when their gun law passed. Literally, the gun dealers just moved to the city limit where they can sell guns virtually undetected. And I do give the NRA credit in that they figured out that it costs very little to buy a member of Congress.
The student protests, this whole march and events, have been most impressive. My question is, they're impressive in reaction to the situation, but to get something to change, you need specific legislation. And when specific legislation is mentioned, Florida being a good example, it gets bogged down really badly. How do you see this mass movement translating back to specific laws that need to be enacted?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And another question is, what's going to happen after the next horrific mass shooting? Because it's coming. So Florida is one of the worst of the worst of the worst. And they actually just enacted the extreme risk protective order legislation. And they raised the age for purchasing firearms. That's unheard of. I mean, this is a state that started the Stand Your Ground movement. Stand Your Ground. I don't know, any lawyers here? I mean, Stand Your Ground is a law in 23 states now. And it says, if you feel threatened, you can use your firearm and shoot somebody. They do not have to be armed. Simply, so here in Massachusetts, we have what's called the Castle Amendment, which is, the big joke was, if you're ever going to kill somebody, on your property, drag them, into your house. Because if you use a firearm in self-defense in your home, chances are it's not going to be a legal issue. But you shoot them outside your home or in public, you're in deep trouble. In Florida, you can use a firearm to kill somebody in public who is not armed. I mean, Zimmerman got away with it with Trayvon Martin. So, Florida did do a few things, but it's going to. This is a marathon, and finally people are waking up because kids are saying BS, and I don't feel safe anymore. And you adults, we're not even going to have you speak on our stage because you look at the position you put us in. So I think if this student-led movement continues, these are voters that are coming on. Like that 11-year-old that spoke from the stage in Washington saying, I'm going to be a voter in 7 years. I mean, it was beautiful. And we need to support those kids. And if we do, there's way more of us than there are of them. And we're going to change Congress and change legislatures. And at some point, there's just no way to ignore that certain states have figured it out, like us. And, they're going to come looking. So it's going to be a while. And, it's going to get worse. I mean, I am not going to fool you.
I'm so sorry that we have run out of time, but I do thank you most warmly. It was a very wonderful presentation.